Hello, my name is Candace Benson. I am the Outreach and Events Coordinator here at VEMS, and I will be your host in this session. In this session, we're excited to have Dr. Jessica Small, Associate Director of Aquaculture Genetics and Breeding Technology. So I'm going to get started with our question and answer session with Dr. Small now. Hello, Dr. Small. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So it looks like we already have quite a few questions coming in.
I saw
I'll try
those.
to group them together. Yeah. So we have a few about the oyster larvae. So what makes the embryo develop into a larvae so fast? How do you feed them, and why do you put them in the refrigerator?
Okay, so first I'll start with the first one. Why do they grow so fast? So they grow really fast in our hands because we give them lots of delicious food. We keep them very warm. So the oyster embryos and then subsequent larvae, we keep them at about 80 degrees, and that helps them grow really quickly. If we keep the temperature lower, they'll grow a lot more slowly. Your other question was about why do we put them in the refrigerator? Well, sometimes we need to transport them to either another researcher, collaborating university, or we need to sample them, for example. So we can actually take them out of the water, rinse them into a standard coffee filter, keep them a little bit wet with salt water, and put them in the refrigerator, and it just slows down their metabolism. It's almost like we make them hibernate for a little while. So we can do that for a couple of days, and then we can wake them up again by taking them out and putting them in water and feeding them, and they'll just keep going that way.
And how do you feed the larvae? Do you dump it in the tank or?
Right. So here, if you were able to come visit today, we could show you how we do that. So our system is very simple. You saw from the video, if you're able to see that, we have the flasks and carboys and cow walls full of algae. What we do is actually just bucket up the algae from those big cow walls, those big tubes, and carry out buckets onto the hatchery floor. And then depending on the cultures, how old they are, how much water they're in, they'll get various amounts of the different species that we grow. So we feed them by hand.
And do you alternate algae, or like how do you feed them one and then another?
Typically, just to make sure that we haven't skipped anything. As it said in the video, we grow different algae species, and they're specific for different stages of larvae. So for example, when we have those 2-day-old D-stage larvae, their first meal is just one algae species called pavlova. Then as they evolve, we add more to their diet. So it's just, our larvae are almost like children in that they start eating something relatively simple, and then we diversify their diet as they need more nutrients.
Awesome. So we do have a question here that says, if both farming methods work equally well, why do you have two methods?
Okay. It's a little bit complicated. We have different farming methods for sort of different purposes. So some of our farming methods, the rack and bag method, for example, we use that primarily to grow out the oysters that we distribute to industry. The long line system, which I believe was shown in the video as well, those hanging baskets, we use those for experimental animals only, because of the type of data that we need to get from them. So they each have a separate purpose.
Okay, makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Do you help support oyster farms in any way?
Absolutely. So if you were to come visit us at VIMS, you can't actually buy oysters from us to eat, and you can't buy seed from us. But what we do is we grow oysters that grow very quickly, that are resistant to diseases and have nice shape, and we give those to the oyster hatcheries. So there are other hatcheries just like ours all around the state and up and down the East Coast that do the hatchery process like you saw in the video. And it's those oysters that end up on your dinner plate. So what we do is we supply the hatcheries, the parents, that they then spawn, grow up, and then sell to the restaurants that you end up eating. So in that way, we directly support the industry.
Very cool. You sort of answered two more questions.
Okay,
is VIMS a major source of seed for the oyster industry? And
no, we cannot sell seed.
And oysters are a popular seafood. Just curious how marine scientists feel about oysters as a food source for people.
Oh, we love the idea of oysters as a food source. And actually, there's a lot of great information out there to look at relative food conversion for a protein source and how efficient oysters are. So for example, if you compare how much food it takes to raise up X number of grams of oyster or oyster meat, and then compare that to how much food it takes to raise a cow, for example, for your hamburger, it's actually a lot more efficient to get protein to have oysters. And oysters are awesome in the sense that we don't have to supply them food. They actually, in the process of filtering the microalgae out of the water, they're getting fed that way. They don't require antibiotics and they don't pollute, and there's no, there's no runoff associated with growing them. So we are huge advocates of oysters as a protein source and as a food source, a sustainable one at that.
Very good points. I hadn't really thought about some of those.
Mm-hmm.
So another question is, how are the oysters tested in the field? What are you looking for?
Okay, so it's sort of an it depends situation, but generally speaking, the most obvious things we're looking for are things like, do they survive? How quickly do they grow? How much meat do they make relative to their size? And that's a term that we call yield. So for an oyster that's, this big, how much meat does it have inside of it? That's really important because you want a meaty oyster to end up on your plate. We also like to look at things like shape. The consumer these days is very picky as they've gotten more and more accustomed to eating oysters. And so we want oysters with a nice deep cup and a nice round shape and pretty shell. So those are all things that we look for in terms of growing them out and testing.
Interesting. There's a lot of factors that go into an oyster.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So we have quite a few. I'll try to summarize them. Why is it important to grow or breed oysters? And does the Oyster Project help restore oysters in the Chesapeake Bay, or are they only used by commercial growers?
Right. So for the first question, could you rephrase that again? Is it why do we breed
Why
them?
is it important to breed and grow oysters?
Okay. So why breeding is important is because there's a lot of factors, a lot of stressors in our environment that affect the wild populations. We used to have tons and tons and tons of oysters here in the bay, but because of pollution, because of overfishing, and because of disease, the wild populations really got wiped out. And there's a lot of stressors that are still there. So in order to have oysters, and oysters that grow quickly, that survive in the face of all of these different stressors, breeding is really important. And so then moving on, your question about restoration. So the oysters that come out of our program are not expressly used for restoration. But I will say with a caveat that because we are such huge supporters of the aquaculture industry, keep in mind that any grower that's growing oysters has oysters out in the water, and they're filtering and having that ecological capacity that oysters on reefs are. So though we don't breed or spawn oysters and put them out on reefs, because of the way that we contribute to the success of the aquaculture industry, we are in our own way helping to restore the bay in terms of water quality improvements, etc. And you get to eat the product at the end of the day.
Very true. Can oysters be used to reduce harmful algal blooms?
They can't be used to reduce them primarily, so they won't graze down harmful algae species, but because they're filter feeders and they do absorb things like nitrogen and phosphorus from the water column, it in essence can reduce the amount of available food sources for harmful algal species.
Oh, okay. Interesting. That's really cool. So they can impact it in some way.
They can, and
That's
there's
really
a
cool.
lot of mixed feelings or concerns about harmful algae in the bay. From my firsthand knowledge, we don't see much of an impact of harmful algae on our oysters. If we do get a bloom here in the York River, which does happen, what we might see is that our baby oysters out in the nursery might not feed anymore. They might just they can sense that there's a toxin or something that's irritating in the water column, and they'll close up and not feed for a little while. So that will slow down their growth. But in our hands, typically, we don't see mortality at all associated with them. It can just slow the growth down.
That's really interesting. So another question is, how are there so many different types of oysters?
That's an evolutionary question, and I wish Roger Mann was here. From my little knowledge about the history of oysters, they date back to the Triassic period. So all the way back in the fossil record in the land of the dinosaurs, oysters first evolved. So why there are so many is that they're so old in terms of evolutionary history. So they've had a lot of time to diversify in all the different environments across the earth. So that's kind of my broad answer to that.
Wow, that's really cool. How many weeks can a naturally forming oyster go to its final stage? So I guess, I mean, how long does it take to reach its final stage in nature rather than in a hatchery?
So it would be similar. So though we strip spawn oysters in the hatchery, they would spawn naturally in the water column. The one thing that would slow them down a little bit would be water temperature, but typically it takes about 2.5 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, and that would be really long. 2 to 2.5 weeks for an embryo to become a set larvae that would set on an oyster reef or on your pier, etc. So it's pretty short.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Someone asked if they are there heritage oysters.
Like a food crop,
I think
maybe.
so, yeah.
Not that
Maybe.
I'm aware of. I mean, they aren't, to my knowledge, bred like your tomato type variety.
Yeah.
So I mean, there are wild oysters and there's a lot of different varieties out there. But I typically haven't heard the term heritage used.
We have are oyster crabs harmful to the oysters?
Oh, okay. So we call those pea crabs. The little tiny crabs that you see in the oysters, they aren't really harmful. They're what we call a commensal. So they can live there quite happily and the oysters keep growing. The one issue that we have with pea crabs, though, is the oysters that have pea crabs in them don't seem to condition well or don't seem to develop eggs and sperm well, like you saw in the video, those oysters that were really fat with all that gamete material. If they have a pea crab in them, sometimes they're a little too irritated and they don't really feel like going through that process. So that's the only issue that we've really seen with them. But from my understanding, they're not a predator. They don't reduce the oyster population. It's a very commensal relationship.
Interesting. I've seen those a couple of times.
Some
really
people keep them and eat them. I mean, who knows?
I have heard that.
Yeah, some people make pea crab soup out of them. I mean, there's
Wow.
a market for everything. Yeah.
That's amazing. So do oysters concentrate toxins in their flesh?
Oh, that's a good question. They can actually. So that's why it's really important and that's why growers, for example, only grow in areas where there are not toxins. And why the Department of Shellfish Sanitation manages grounds where people harvest from very thoroughly. You can be assured if you're eating oysters in a restaurant, they've come from a farm in an area that has clean water, and there's no health issue, there's no health risk there whatsoever. Fortunately, where we are, the toxins that we might have from harmful algae, for example, to my knowledge, aren't really an issue in terms of human consumption. There are places in other states, however, where you can get paralytic shellfish poisoning from HABs or harmful algae in the water. And so in that instance, because they do monitor very regularly for those HAB species, they will shut the grounds to harvesting. So that is a risk, and that's why they're heavily monitored.
Gotcha. And I believe Dr. Ryan Carnegie will talk more on that in a later session.
Cool.
But
yeah.
Wow. So are there any concerns that breeding oysters will reduce the genetic diversity in wild populations?
That's a really good question. Well, let's see. It's kind of a loaded question. So I guess it could be possible, but at the same time, the oysters that we breed, we do try to keep their genetic diversity very high. And at the same time, if there is crossing of bred oysters, the diploid oysters that might be out in the water, selected oysters with wild populations, it's likely that we would be conferring them beneficial genes anyway, because our oysters do grow fast and they are disease resistant. some crossing with the wild populations could be very beneficial. But we also, I should say that most of what's grown for aquacultured oysters these days are a triploid oyster. And I know that we didn't get into that in the video, but generally speaking, the triploid oysters don't spawn. So there is really in that case no risk of crossing with wild populations because you're putting an oyster out in the water that will never reproduce.
Very true. So we have a couple more questions that I'm going to ask because our time is running
Sure.
low. The first one is, can and should I grow them in a basket on my dock?
That's a good question. You can if you want to. Should you? That's entirely up to you. The real question is, should you eat them? Because it is important that you don't eat oysters from an area that's condemned to harvesting. If you are interested in growing oysters off your dock, I would encourage you to reach out to local organizations like TOGA, which is the Tidewater Oyster Growers Association, or the Master Oyster Gardeners in this area. And also look at the VDH website to look for areas that are open or closed to shellfish harvesting, because that will give you an idea of whether how to go about it, first and foremost, by talking to someone at TOGA, but also whether it's safe to eat them. And it may be that there's certain times of year that it is safe and that it isn't safe. But if you have the opportunity, I certainly would encourage you to grow oysters because they are ecologically very, very valuable and they're delicious. So.
Very true. So our last question is sort of something that I think we can both sort of answer. Where's the hatchery and when do you give tours? So if you want to go into the hatchery details.
Right, so the hatchery that was featured in our tour is here at our Gloucester Point campus. It's just at the bottom of, kind of the bottom of the hill as you go down to the Gloucester Point beach. Typically, if we weren't closed to the public, we would give tours pretty much any time of year. We typically start our spawning season in April and go through August or so. So that would be the best time of year to come visit us. So hopefully next year we'll be open and you can come on a tour yourself and we can show you all of this in real time.
Yes. Yeah, we try to organize tours more so in the summertime.
Right.
So, and it's definitely more action going on there as well.
Okay.
And we also have the Kaufman Aquaculture Center.
Right, and the Kaufman Aquaculture Center, yep, that's up in Topping, so it's about 40 minutes from here in Lockleys Creek. And so we operate both hatcheries pretty much simultaneously throughout the year. So if you're up that way, there's also an opportunity to have a tour up there. And a little plug for industry, there's a Rappahannock River Oyster Company is right around the corner. If you've never had a chance to taste oysters, you could get a tour of the Kaufman Center and then you could go taste some oysters as well. And we actually grow some of our oysters on those grounds right around the corner from Rappahannock's business. So I encourage you, everybody go out to your local restaurants, try some oysters. Think about it as not only are you getting a great and healthy protein source, but you're saving the bay one oyster at a time. So eat shellfish.
Very pro oyster industry.
Yeah, for sure.
Definitely. All right, so I have been told that we will add the TOGA resources on the resource page, so go check that out if you want that information. It looks like our time is up, and I just want to thank you, Dr. Small, for joining us today and helping us learn more about the oyster industry and what a hatchery does and why it's important. It has been a pleasure, and we want to thank First Advantage Federal Credit Union for supporting this session, and have a great day. Thank you.